Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise to get to the heart of what's truly happening. You know how some concepts just seem to constantly swirl in the news, endlessly debated, but truly understanding their depth and nuance can feel, well, incredibly challenging. Today, we're doing exactly that. We're embarking on a deep dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion, widely known as DEI, and its crucial interconnected concepts: institutional racism, implicit bias, and white privilege. Our mission, really, in this deep dive is to unpack these terms, trace their often surprising historical roots, explore the passionate arguments both for and against them, and grasp their profound impact across various sectors and countries. We'll be drawing from a collection of sources that lay out the definitions, the history, and the current, sometimes quite heated conversations around these complex ideas.
That's right. And this isn't just about, you know, memorizing definitions. It's about seeing how these ideas have shaped and really continue to shape societies. Understanding them is truly key to navigating our world. And we'll be looking at all the nuances and different perspectives presented in the material to give you a truly well-rounded view.
Right. And given that our audience is already pretty dialed into these topics, let's maybe start by quickly aligning on what our sources define as the core components of DEI. Just to ensure we're all speaking the same language, so to speak, what exactly do diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, according to the material?
Okay, so DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These aren't just like trendy buzzwords. Our sources show they're distinct yet deeply interwoven concepts. Diversity refers to the sheer presence of variety, in backgrounds, experiences, identities within a group.
The mix of people, basically.
Exactly. Then equity. This one's key. It means fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all. But crucially, it also means actively striving to eliminate the systemic barriers that have historically prevented the full participation of some groups.
So it's not just equal treatment, it's fair treatment, acknowledging different starting points.
Precisely. And inclusion, the third piece, is the practice of ensuring that everyone feels a true sense of belonging and feels valued within that diverse environment. They're really designed to work together, these three, to create a genuinely supportive space.
That's a clear breakdown. Thanks. It makes me wonder, though, how do these concepts, particularly equity and inclusion, how do they tie into the historical efforts we've seen, like affirmative action? Was DEI sort of a natural evolution?
That's a great question. It's a critical historical link, actually. Affirmative action as a policy was intended to promote opportunities for defined minority groups to achieve equal access. You saw it often in governmental and educational settings, right?
Right. College admissions, government contracts.
Exactly. And its philosophical basis has always been, well, threefold: compensation for past discrimination, correction of current discrimination, and the diversification of society. What our sources indicate is that DEI concepts have more recently broadened beyond just addressing discrimination. They now encompass diversity, equity, and inclusion as wider motives for preferring historically underrepresented groups. So the focus is broader than just correcting past wrongs.
Okay, that connects the dots nicely. It's a wider frame. Now let's turn to two other terms that frequently emerge in these discussions, often carrying a lot of weight: institutional racism and implicit bias. How do our sources differentiate these, and what's their real-world impact?
Absolutely, and they are distinct. Institutional racism, which you also hear called systemic racism, is a form of discrimination based on race or ethnic group that's like embedded within the policies and practices of an entire society or organization.
So not just one person's prejudice.
Not at all. It results in unfair advantage for some and unfair or harmful treatment for others. Think of it manifesting in areas like criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, education, political representation. It's broad. A key insight here is that the term itself was coined way back in 1967 by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Defeat Hamilton, and they specifically emphasized its less overt, far more subtle nature compared to individual acts of racism. It's often about how the systems themselves are built.
Subtle but powerful. Okay. And implicit bias, how does that fit in?
Right. So implicit bias, sometimes called unconscious bias, these are the societal stereotypes individuals unconsciously form about groups of people, often without any conscious awareness or, bad intent.
Things we pick up without realizing.
Exactly. These biases are learned over a lifetime of media exposure, personal experiences, and they can influence our actions in really subtle ways, even when we consciously believe in equality.
Okay. And finally, before we move on, a concept that truly sparks a lot of discussion and sometimes defensiveness: white privilege. What does our source material tell us about this?
Yeah, this one definitely gets a reaction. White privilege is defined in the sources as societal privilege based on skin lightness. Peggy McIntosh famously described it as an invisible package of unearned assets.
An invisible package.
Right. It refers to the obvious and, maybe more importantly, the less obvious passive advantages that white people may not even recognize they have. It's distinct from overt bias or prejudice. This includes things like cultural affirmations of one's worth, presumed greater social status, and a general freedom to move, work, play, speak freely without their race being a constant factor or consideration.
Like not having to think about it all the time.
Exactly. And it also implies the right to assume the universality of one's own experiences, sort of perceiving oneself as the norm while marking others as different.
Okay, with those definitions set, I'm particularly curious about how these concepts, which feel so modern in our current discourse, actually have deep historical roots. Let's trace their journey, especially focusing on the United States, as our sources provide a detailed timeline there.
It is fascinating, isn't it, how long some of these ideas, or at least precursors, have been at play. Our sources show early efforts in the U.S. included preferential hiring for veterans of the U.S. Civil War and their widows, way back in 1865.
1865.
Yeah, and this was later formalized by the Veterans Preference Act of 1944 and subsequent amendments. It even included special provisions for disabled veterans and mothers of disabled or deceased veterans. So this idea of preferential treatment for certain groups, it has a much longer history than we might assume.
That's a really surprising detail about the Veterans Preference Act, predating so much of the modern DEI conversation.
Yeah.
It definitely puts the historical context into perspective. But have the specific concept of diversity enter legal and business discourse in a way that truly shaped our current understanding?
Well, a real landmark moment was the Bake decision of 1978. That's Regents of the University of California v. Bake. The Supreme Court ruled that strict quotas based on race were illegal in admissions.
Right, quotas were out.
But, critically, it allowed race to be considered as a plus factor, specifically to foster diversity in classes. That decision basically made diversity itself a constitutional law factor.
Yeah.
It gave it legal standing.
So that was the legal foothold.
Yes. Then, in the 1980s, the theme of diversity really started gaining momentum beyond just legal mandates. You had professionals and consultants starting to make a compelling business case for diversity.
The business case.
Exactly. Promoting it not just as a legal requirement, but as a competitive advantage for organizations. Better ideas, wider markets, that sort of thing.
Shifting the rationale.
Right. And then throughout the 1990s, we saw key legislative acts reinforcing related ideas. The Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, requiring reasonable accommodations and accessibility. And the Veterans Employment Opportunities Act in 1998, further helping veterans access federal jobs and protecting them from discrimination. So it's building, piece by piece.
So we've moved from a sort of historical mandates and legal rulings to this business case. Beyond that practical argument, what are the core justifications and arguments our sources put forth for DEI initiatives today? What's the driving force now?
Well, the philosophical basis, which connects back to affirmative action and now extends to DEI, still really boils down to those three core points we mentioned. 1, compensation for past discrimination. 2, correction of current discrimination. And 3, the broader goal of diversifying society.
Okay, those core principles remain.
They do. And the business case is still very strong, maybe even stronger now with more data. Studies, our sources cite ones from 2013 and 2024, for instance, have consistently shown a positive correlation between increased workforce diversity and improved performance. There's even research suggesting a plausible causal link between workforce gender diversity and better financial performance in major firms.
So tangible results.
Tangible result. Think of it like having a richer tapestry of ideas, perspectives, experiences. It often leads to more creative solutions and ultimately better outcomes. Plus, beyond pure business metrics, there's another rationale our sources highlight. Businesses and corporations, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're part of a larger society.
True.
So there's an argument they need DEI to improve coworker relations, teamwork, and just generally reflect the society they operate within and serve. And academically, the commitment is significant. As of 2022, many U.S. institutions have deeply committed to DEI through official documents, specific programs, dedicated staff.
You see DEI offices everywhere now.
Exactly. And many accreditation agencies now even require DEI support. Information and training have become widespread for students and professors, and some scholarships are specifically designed to encourage diversity in academia.
So there are clear and, pretty compelling rationales being put forward. But as we know, our sources also indicate significant pushback and controversy, particularly in the U.S. What does the material reveal about this countercurrent? What's driving the opposition?
Oh, it's a strong countercurrent indeed, very visible. Since 2023, particularly, Republican-dominated U.S. state legislatures have considered, and in many cases passed, a lot of bills against DEI efforts. The focus has often been state colleges and universities.
Right, higher education seems to be a major battleground.
It is, and the Supreme Court's Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard decision in June 2023 really amplified things. That decision effectively eliminated race-conscious affirmative action in college admissions, as we knew it.
A huge shift.
A huge shift. And it further intensified conservative efforts to dismantle race-conscious policies, not just in education, but across various sectors.
Yeah.
We've seen specific state laws emerge as a result, or strengthened. Florida, for instance, prohibits public colleges from requiring what they call political loyalty tests for hiring or promotion, or spending state or federal funds on DEI, unless it's federally mandated.
Okay.
Texas also passed laws prohibiting DEI practices, programs, offices, staff, mandatory training, and also banning identity-based diversity statements that give preference based on race or sex. Iowa is also advancing similar bills, according to our sources.
So real legislative action rolling back DEI.
Yes, and this political climate seems to have had ripples in the corporate world, too. Our sources mention a corporate rollback of some DEI efforts, citing examples like Google, PBS, McDonald's, Meta, some ending or scaling back diversity goals they had previously announced.
But not all companies.
No, definitely not all. Others, like Deutsche Bank and the NFL, are mentioned as standing firm on their commitments. So it's a mixed picture in the corporate space.
That's a wide range of responses, from state houses to boardrooms. Our sources also mention significant U.S. government actions in 2025. What's happening on that federal front, and how has it been received?
Right. The federal level has seen major changes, according to the material. The current administration signed an executive order ending DEI programs within the federal government itself. It also ordered an end to affirmative action in federal contracting and even put federal DEI staff on paid leave with the intention of them being laid off.
Wow, that's drastic.
It is. And military academies, our sources note, also ended affirmative action in their admissions processes in April 2025.
Yeah.
This has, perhaps predictably, led to strong pushback. The sources mentioned Baltimore suing the administration over these changes.
Legal challenges, then.
Yes. And interestingly, there have been international reactions, too. Apparently, countries like France and Belgium have pushed back against U.S. diplomatic pressure regarding anti-DEI policies in their own companies. They're sort of saying, mind your own business.
Well, so it really does have global ripple effects.
Fascinating. Even within the Democratic Party in the U.S., our sources note a growing divide, citing comments from Representative Adam Smith regarding some DEI efforts implying racism is uniquely white, which he questioned.
Okay, that's a comprehensive look at the arguments and the pushback. Let's maybe drill down into some specific areas of controversy that our sources detail. Starting with diversity training. This seems to be a real lightning rod, doesn't it?
It certainly is, and the research on it is, well, maybe surprising to some. Studies, and apparently this dates back even to the 1930s, suggest that implicit bias training on its own doesn't really work effectively to reduce bias long-term, alter behavior, or fundamentally improve the workplace.
Doesn't really work. That's a strong statement.
Well, the sources suggest it might serve as part of a larger, more comprehensive solution, but organizations that rely solely on, say, a one-off training session often risk complacency. They tick the box, but nothing fundamentally changes.
Like a quick fix that isn't really a fix.
Exactly. Think about it, you're trying to change attitudes and behaviors learned over a lifetime, maybe through media, upbringing, experiences. Expecting a short-term intervention, like a single workshop, to undo all that is probably unrealistic.
So what does work, according to the sources? What are the recommendations?
The sources suggest several improvements. One is introducing interventions much earlier, like in early childhood, focusing on school settings and embedding values of fairness and understanding from a young age.
Starting earlier. Makes sense.
Another is reframing implicit bias, not as some deep moral failing, but more like a habit of mind that can be recognized and consciously changed over time.
Less blame, more skill building.
Kind of. Also focusing more on the systems and structural inequities, rather than just individual culpability or feelings. Integrating these discussions into broader ongoing professional development, not just isolated DEI training. And crucially, ensuring training is seen as voluntary and developmental, rather than something punitive or imposed, which can just create resistance and backlash.
So If I'm understanding correctly, the sources suggest that even good intentions in areas like diversity training can fall short if they don't address the deeper structural issues and how individuals actually engage with the material. Is that the gist?
Precisely. It really has to be about depth and systemic change, not just surface level awareness or, frankly, checking a box.
Okay. That leads us naturally to another area of academic controversy, mandatory diversity statements in hiring and promotion. What does the material reveal about the arguments for and against those?
Well, this is another area where we see significant pushback. Several U.S. states have banned mandatory diversity statements in public universities. And notably, MIT became the first major private university to abandon the practice in 2024.
MIT did. Interesting. Why the controversy?
The core debate is often around academic freedom and whether these statements constitute a political litmus test. Our sources give a really striking example from UC Berkeley. Apparently, in one faculty search, out of nearly 1,000 applications, only 214 were advanced after an initial review based solely on their written contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Wow. Solely on the statement.
That's what the source indicates for that initial cut. It highlights the significant weight these statements can carry in the process and fuels the debate about their use as a primary screening tool versus considering a candidate's entire record.
That's a stark example indeed. It really clarifies the stakes. Another critical distinction often debated, especially when talking policy, is equity versus equality. You touched on this earlier. Can you clarify again how our sources define these often confused terms?
Absolutely, because the difference is fundamental to many DEI discussions. Equality, as defined in the material, implies treating everyone as if their experiences are exactly the same. It means providing everyone with the same resources or opportunities.
Like giving everyone the same size box to stand on, regardless of height.
That's a common analogy, yes. Equity, on the other hand, aims for fair treatment, access, and opportunity. It often involves adjusting resources to account for historical or systemic disadvantages, ensuring everyone has what they need to reach a similar outcome.
So giving people different size boxes so they can all see over the fence?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this is where the controversy comes in. Critics often view equity's focus on outcomes as striving for equality of outcome, which they contrast with the principle of equality of opportunity. This difference is sometimes called the dilemma of difference, and it represents a core tension in the entire conversation. How do you treat people differently to achieve fairness without creating new problems?
That tension around equity versus equality brings us directly to concerns about free speech and academic freedom. Sometimes a single event can ignite a broader debate, right? And the material mentions the tragic 2023 suicide of former Toronto principal Richard Bilkstow. What does this case illuminate about the potential conflict between these values and DEI initiatives?
That incident, sadly, really highlights a potential flashpoint. Richard Bilkstow had sued his school board after a DEI training session. He claimed he was accused of bullying and promoting white supremacy simply for questioning some of the content presented, specifically about Canada's history relative to the U.S.
Just for asking questions.
That was his claim. The situation apparently led to him being diagnosed with anxiety secondary to a workplace event. His suicide understandably generated international attention and renewed debate on the intersection of DEI, freedom of speech, and workplace dynamics. The anti-racism trainer involved welcomed a review and stated the incident was being weaponized to discredit important DEI work.
So, conflicting perspectives on the event itself.
Yes, but the core tension it exposed remains. How do you foster open dialogue, critical thinking, and learning within DEI frameworks when individuals might feel stifled or even professionally harmed for asking questions or expressing dissent? It's a difficult balance.
It really is. Our sources also highlight concerns from specific communities about how DEI programming sometimes plays out for them. Let's talk about anti-Semitism and the disability community.
Yes, these are important points raised in the material. There are documented concerns that some DEI programming can inadvertently exclude or even target Jewish students, with specific issues like anti-Semitism sometimes being ignored or not fully addressed within the standard DEI frameworks being used.
Overlooked within the framework.
That's the concern raised. Similarly, despite the Americans with Disabilities Act being law for decades, the disability community often feels significantly overlooked in many corporate and institutional DEI efforts. Our sources note that businesses frequently disregard people with disabilities in their diversity initiatives, essentially missing a huge and crucial aspect of true inclusion.
So, gaps in the application of the principles.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
or blind spots.
Finally, within these specific controversies, there's the sensitive issue of the diversity hire label. That sounds like it could have a real personal impact on individuals.
Absolutely. Being labeled or even perceiving oneself as being seen as a diversity hire can indeed have a negative psychological impact. It can force individuals to constantly negotiate their identity and qualifications, particularly in academic job searches or other highly competitive professional settings. It can really undermine their sense of accomplishment and belonging.
Feeling like you have to prove yourself twice as hard.
That's often the sentiment expressed. And circling back briefly to white privilege, which we defined earlier, the sources note how this academic-sounding concept can elicit defensiveness and misunderstanding among white people, especially as it moved from academia into the mainstream discourse.
Right, the defensiveness aspect.
Yes. And what's particularly interesting and frankly a bit counterintuitive is that 2019 study we touched on briefly. It found that reading about white privilege didn't actually increase empathy for minorities among the white participants studied. It actually decreased it.
That's a really striking finding, decreased empathy. Do the sources offer any deeper analysis on why that might happen or suggest ways to maybe mitigate that reaction?
They do offer some potential explanations. The study suggested it might be due to participants perceiving the concept as a form of blame or feeling personally attacked. This could lead to a defensive reaction rather than an empathetic one. It implies that the framing of the concept is absolutely crucial. How it's presented matters immensely.
So the delivery can backfire.
It seems so. And another study, this one from 2022, looked at online discussions. It found that simply mentioning the term white privilege often led to those discussions becoming less constructive, more polarized, and less supportive of racially progressive policies.
Wow.
It suggests the language itself, perhaps because it becomes so loaded, can sometimes hinder the very goals of understanding and progress it seeks to achieve. Nuance gets lost online, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Okay, we've focused primarily on the U.S. context so far, understandably given the sources. But the discussion around DEI and institutional racism isn't confined there, as you mentioned earlier. Our sources touch on global applications, sometimes with different terminology. What does that broader picture look like?
It's definitely a global conversation, you're right. Though the specific terminology and the main priorities can differ quite a bit depending on the country and its history. For instance, sources suggest Japan and Iceland tend to focus more on gender and age equality. India grapples significantly with biases stemming from its patriarchal structures, the caste system, and religious diversity.
Different historical contexts shaping the focus.
Exactly. Many African countries emphasize the intersectionality of gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic backgrounds, how those factors overlap. Even Nordic countries, often seen as highly egalitarian, face challenges from cultural norms like the law of Jante.
The law of Jante, what's that?
It's a cultural concept, sort of an unspoken rule, emphasizing conformity and downplaying individual achievement or difference. It can subtly hinder acknowledging inequality because it discourages pointing out disparities.
Interesting. So culture plays a big role.
A huge role. And globally, organizations like IDG certification examine a wide range of DEI criteria. I think our sources mentioned 19 key ones. These cover everything from paid maternity and paternity leave, childcare costs, hiring quotas for people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus non-discrimination policies, gender quotas on corporate boards, laws on pay equity, pay gap reporting, a whole spectrum.
So the issues are widespread, even if the labels or emphasis shifts. Now, connecting this back to institutional racism specifically, how does that manifest differently across the globe? Our sources provided a lot of really detailed examples. Maybe you could highlight just a few that really underscore the different forms it takes.
Absolutely. The variability is striking. If we look at Algeria under French colonialism, the courses describe it as quasi-apartheid. It wasn't just individual prejudice, it was deeply embedded in policies. Things like systematic land appropriation from locals, discriminatory taxation where Muslims paid more despite having lower incomes.
Built into the system itself.
Completely. And a severe detriment to Muslim education. Less than 5% of Muslim children attended school as late as 1870. The 1865 colonial law only allowed Arab and Berber Algerians to get French citizenship if they abandoned their Muslim identity. And by 1947, a European's vote was literally worth 7 times a Muslim's vote in the legislature. That's systemic engineering of inequality.
That's incredibly stark. What about somewhere like the UAE?
In the United Arab Emirates, the sources point to systemic racism primarily operating through the kafala or sponsorship system and also citizenship policies that heavily favor native Emiratis. This leads to widespread discrimination in employment, legal rights, and social mobility, disproportionately affecting South Asian, African and Southeast Asian migrant workers, who actually make up about 90% of the workforce there.
90%?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the kafala system itself is strongly criticized by human rights groups as being akin to a form of modern-day slavery because of the extreme power imbalance it creates between employer and worker.
Okay, in another very different context, what about China?
China presents multiple examples according to our sources. For the Uyghur population, it details widespread persecution and mass detentions in what are called re-education camps since 2017. The descriptions include torture, forced labor, religious discrimination, political indoctrination, and forced sterilization, leading to birth rates dropping drastically in some Uyghur regions. Some sources explicitly describe this situation as an ongoing genocide.
That's incredibly serious.
Extremely. For Tibetans, the sources describe institutional racism operating through propaganda, portraying them as liberated serfs, alongside policies like forced birth control and an inequitable education system designed to prevent them from learning their own history, culture, and language, even involving racial segregation in schools.
So targeting specific ethnic minorities within the country?
Yes. And then there's also documented anti-African sentiment, including historical incidents of racist attacks, racial profiling, police brutality, racist portrayals in state media like blackface sketches, and discriminatory actions during the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically targeting Africans.
Okay, and maybe one more example, the UK.
Sure. In the United Kingdom, institutional racism is noted particularly in healthcare. The statistics cited are alarming. Black women being 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy or labor than white women, Asian women twice as likely. Minorities also face higher rates of being sectioned under mental health laws, potential over-medication, and misdiagnosis.
In healthcare?
Yes. And it's often argued this isn't necessarily about overt prejudice from every single doctor, but about embedded patterns, assumptions, and perhaps lack of cultural competency within the healthcare system itself. Even things like employment standards regarding eye contact, which differs across cultures, or biometric e-gates at airports reportedly flagging people from certain countries more often, can be seen as forms of institutional bias.
Those examples powerfully illustrate just how deeply institutional racism can be woven into the fabric of societies in so many different ways. That brings us back, full circle almost, to a concept we introduced earlier, one that often sparks so much discussion here: white privilege. Let's really dig into how this invisible package of unearned assets, as McIntosh put it, manifests in practical terms today, building on what we've already discussed.
Right. So revisiting white privilege, it refers to those often unseen, unearned advantages that white individuals might experience simply due to their skin color in a society structured around racial hierarchies. It's distinct from overt bias, more about the passive benefits, the cultural affirmations, the presumed social status, that sense of freedom and normalcy we talked about.
The default setting, almost.
In many ways, yes. Historically, its roots are traced back to European colonialism and slavery, whereas arguably at its most extreme and explicit. And W.E.B. Du Bois, way back in 1935, talked about a psychological wage for white laborers. This concept suggested that even low-paid white workers received a non-economic benefit, a sense of superiority over black workers, which helped maintain the racial hierarchy.
A psychological wage. Interesting concept. So fast forward to today. What does this actually look like in practical terms in the United States, according to our sources? Let's break it down by a few key areas, maybe like wealth, employment, education.
Okay, absolutely. In terms of wealth, the sources emphasize that wealth isn't just about income. It's a measure of cumulative advantage or disadvantage over generations. Historically, many major institutions of wealth creation in the U.S. were often exclusively, or primarily, open to whites. Think about the initial Social Security Act, which excluded agricultural and domestic workers' occupations predominantly held by people of color at the time.
Right, excluding whole categories.
It's exactly. Or military benefits after WWII, which were distributed unevenly. And crucially, the Federal Housing Act of 1934. FHA policies effectively funneled money towards white home buyers and actively encouraged the segregation of suburbs through practices like redlining, denying mortgages or insurance in predominantly black neighborhoods.
Redlining, yeah, that had a huge impact.
Massive. It basically denied a primary source of generational wealth home ownership to black Americans for decades. This created huge pre-existing disparities in wealth that continue today, even when you control for income. And this wealth gap impacts everything from the quality of neighborhoods people can afford to live in to the funding and quality of local schools.
Which creates cycles.
Exactly. Vicious cycles. Then in employment economics, the sources discuss how racialized employment networks can often benefit whites. There was a 2003 study mentioned that found white male graduates from the same school with the same skills ended up more often in skilled trades, earned more, got more promotions, and had shorter periods of unemployment compared to their black counterparts.
Same skills, different outcomes.
And the researchers attributed a lot of that difference to social networking accessing opportunities through existing, often predominantly white, networks. Other studies found that resumes with white-sounding names were 50% more likely to get callbacks for interviews compared to identical resumes with black-sounding names.
50%, that's huge.
It is. And white Americans are statistically more likely to have business loans approved. Black and Latino college graduates are less likely to end up in management positions compared to their white peers. It's a pattern across the economic sphere.
Okay, so wealth, employment.
Yeah.
What about education?
In education, policies have also contributed. Even after legal desegregation, integrated schools sometimes maintained internal segregation through tracking systems, grouping students by perceived ability. This often magnified unequal experiences for minority students within the same building.
Tracking.
Plus, there's ongoing debate about whether standardized tests and other academic assessments are culturally biased towards white, Western, middle-class norms, potentially disadvantaging students from other backgrounds.
The tests themselves might be biased.
That's the argument. Now, conversely, some critics argue the concept of white privilege exaggerates its effects. They might suggest that black individuals might incorrectly blame personal failures on systemic oppression or point to what they see as minority privileges, like universities actively seeking diversity through affirmative action type programs.
So counter-arguments exist.
Yes. And interestingly, a 2019 National Bureau of Economic Research study actually found evidence of white privilege bias in favor of white applicants at Harvard, specifically through legacy admissions preferences given to children of alumni who are disproportionately white.
Legacy admissions, that's a hot topic.
It is. And the sources even mentioned a 2013 Fox News report about a Pentagon training manual that apparently taught that healthy, white, heterosexual, Christian men hold an unfair advantage and instructed troops to support the leadership of non-white people. That caused quite a stir.
I can imagine. Okay, that gives us a pretty comprehensive picture of the U.S. experience as described in the sources. How does white privilege manifest globally, though, in different cultural contexts, given that race and identity are constructed so differently around the world?
That's a key point. It does manifest differently, reflecting local histories and power structures. In parts of Africa, for example, like Namibia during apartheid, the sources note that white women undeniably experienced white privilege relative to black women, even while being subject to patriarchal systems themselves. In post-apartheid South Africa, while the Constitution allows for laws to address past unfair discrimination, some white South Africans express fear of reverse racism, highlighting the complex and contested nature of these dynamics after decades of legal white supremacy.
So historical context is everything.
Absolutely. In Asia, the sources mention Japan and South Korea, where there are noted positive associations with lightness or whiteness, sometimes linked to Western influence or ideals. It's mentioned that white native English teachers in Japan might experience privilege in getting jobs, sometimes even without the professional qualifications others might need.
An advantage in the job market.
Potentially. In South Korea, sources suggest whites can be somewhat revered, and multiracial individuals with white heritage might also experience aspects of white privilege in places like Seoul due to these societal associations with whiteness.
Okay. And Oceania, Australia, New Zealand.
In Oceania, particularly Australia and New Zealand, the sources discuss how news media is often geared towards white people and their interests, how white neighborhoods are typically identified as good quality by default. Whiteness is often the presumed norm of being Australian or New Zealander.
The default again?
Yes. A major part of white Australian privilege, according to one analysis, is simply the ability to be in Australia itself, a privilege reinforced by political discourse, often focused on non-white outsiders or immigration control. White Australians can also often identify with a global diaspora of other white people, which contrasts sharply with the historical and ongoing separation and dispossession experienced by Indigenous Australians.
That connection to a global identity. Interesting.
And in New Zealand, there's ongoing discussion specifically about Pakeha privilege, which refers to the advantages associated with being New Zealanders of European descent.
Pakeha privilege. Okay. Finally, let's just touch on how this concept of white privilege has entered popular culture and the online discourse, especially since it feels so prevalent now compared to, say, 20 years ago.
It really marked its transition from academic circles to mainstream prominence probably in the early 2010s. The rise of social media played a huge role, as did movements like Black Lives Matter, which brought issues of systemic racism and privilege to the forefront of public consciousness.
Social media amplified it.
Greatly. And you see it in pop culture, too. The sources mention Macklemore's 2016 song White Privilege 2 as a clear example of the concept entering mainstream music and discussion.
Right, I remember that song.
But there's also criticism noted in the sources about how this plays out online. Some argue that white people publicly acknowledging their white privilege online, while maybe well-intentioned, can sometimes become self-serving or performative.
Performative acknowledgement.
Yes, the idea that it doesn't necessarily translate into concrete actions that address actual inequalities. Just saying, I have privilege, doesn't dismantle the systems that grant it. And remember that 2022 study we mentioned? It found that just bringing up white privilege in online discussions often made them less constructive and more polarized. So the way it's discussed in popular forums can be problematic.
Okay, wow. We've certainly navigated through a complex and, at times, contentious landscape today. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, institutional racism, implicit bias, white privilege. We've looked at their definitions, their historical evolution, the arguments for their importance, the significant criticisms they face, and how they manifest differently across the globe.
Yeah, the material really shows us that these are not simple concepts, are they? And they're certainly not static. They're deeply embedded in history, in policy, in our everyday human interactions. And they continue to shape opportunities and experiences worldwide. Understanding the nuances, the multiple perspectives, the arguments and counterarguments as presented in the sources, it seems crucial for anyone trying to make sense of current events and societal structures.
Absolutely. What stands out most to you after exploring this deep dive into the material? If you had to pick one thing, how do these interconnected ideas inform your understanding moving forward?
For me, I think it's the sheer interconnectedness, but also the ongoing debate and the vastly different approaches we see globally. It really highlights that addressing these deep-seated issues requires continuous learning, critical thinking, maybe some humility, and a real willingness to understand the deeply systemic nature of these challenges, not just the surface symptoms.
Continuous learning and critical thinking. That's a great takeaway. And for you, our listeners, for your own further exploration, maybe consider this. We saw specific examples today of how institutional racism operated historically under French colonialism in Algeria, through the Indian Acts and residential schools in Canada, the kafala system in the UAE, redlining in the US. How might really understanding those specific historical patterns and legal structures, the mechanics of past injustice, change how one approaches solutions for fostering true diversity and equity in any given context today? Think about how those historical patterns, those specific mechanisms, might still be resonating, perhaps in disguised forms within our modern challenges, something to mull over.